wide rivers, tall forests, green valleys, and open plains that seemed to go on forever. And this land was not empty. It was full of life, full of people. These people had lived there for thousands of years. They had their own languages, their own stories, their own ways of living with the earth. We call them the Native Americans, or indigenous peoples. There were hundreds of different groups: the Cherokee, the Sioux, the Iroquois, the Navajo, and many, many more. Each group had its own culture, its own wisdom, its own deep connection to the land. They knew this land better than anyone. They understood the rivers, the seasons, the animals, and the plants. For them, this land was not something to own. It was something to care for. And for thousands of years, they lived in harmony with it. But far away, across a wide and dangerous ocean, something was changing. People in a place called Europe were curious. They were restless. They were searching. And soon that search would bring them here, to this quiet, beautiful land. What would happen when two very different worlds finally met? That is where our story truly begins. In the late 1400s, people in Europe were filled with curiosity. They wanted to find new places, new goods, and new trade routes. Ships were getting better. Maps were slowly improving. And brave, sometimes foolish, men were willing to sail into the unknown. In 1492, a man named Christopher Columbus sailed west from Spain. He believed he could reach Asia by going the other way around the world. He was wrong about that. But what he found instead changed history forever. He landed on islands near a continent that Europeans had never seen before. He called the people he met Indians because he thought he was near India. He was not. But his journey opened a door, and once that door was open, it could never be closed again. After Columbus, more and more Europeans came. Spanish explorers traveled through the south. French explorers moved through the north. And they all saw the same thing: a land full of resources, full of possibility. The word spread quickly across Europe. There was a new world across the ocean, and everyone wanted a piece of it. But the people who already lived there, the ones who had called this land home for thousands of years, were not asked. They were not given a choice. And that is a truth we must always remember as we listen to this story. History is never told from just one side. Among all the European countries, England was determined to build something lasting in this new land. In 1607, a group of English settlers arrived in a place they called Jamestown, in what is now the state of Virginia. These were not soldiers or kings. Many of them were ordinary people, men who hoped to find gold, to start a new life, or simply to survive. But the beginning was incredibly hard. The land was unfamiliar, the climate was difficult, food was scarce. Many settlers became sick. In the first year alone, more than half of them died. It was a dark and desperate time. But the ones who survived did not give up. They learned, slowly and painfully, how to plant crops and how to live in this new place. Some of them received help from Native Americans who taught them which plants to grow and how to find food. Without that help, Jamestown would have failed completely. And yet, even as they received this kindness, the English settlers continued to take more and more land that was not theirs. It is one of the painful contradictions at the heart of this story, a story of courage and survival on one side, and loss and injustice on the other. The English kept coming. More ships, more settlers, more small towns growing slowly along the eastern coast of this enormous continent. Something was being built, something that had never existed before, and nobody yet knew exactly what it would become. Over the next 100 years, more and more English settlers came to America. By the early 1700s, there were 13 separate colonies along the eastern coast. A colony is a place that is ruled by another country far away. These 13 colonies were all ruled by England. The people who lived there were called colonists. They came from different places and had different beliefs. Some came for religious freedom. Some came to find work and land. Some were brought by force, enslaved Africans who had no choice and no freedom. This is one of the darkest parts of American history, and it is important not to forget it. Slavery was a terrible injustice that caused enormous suffering and left wounds that lasted for centuries. But for many of the colonists, especially those who came freely, life in America felt different. The land was wide, the opportunities felt real, and slowly, a new identity began to grow. People started to think of themselves not just as English, but as American. They built towns, farms, churches, and schools. They created local governments where ordinary people had a voice in decisions, something that was quite unusual in the world at that time. Life was hard, but it was also full of a quiet sense of possibility. And as the colonies grew stronger, richer, and more confident, they began to ask a question that would soon shake the entire world. If we can govern ourselves here, in these towns and these fields, why do we need a king across the ocean to rule over us? By the 1760s, the relationship between the American colonies and England was becoming difficult. England had spent a lot of money fighting wars in other parts of the world, including wars that affected the American colonies. Now, the English government decided that the colonists should help pay for those wars through taxes. A tax is money that people must pay to the government. England began adding taxes to everyday things: paper, glass, paint, and most famously, tea. The colonists were furious. And the reason for their anger was not just the money, it was the principle. The colonists had no representatives in the English Parliament, the place where these tax decisions were made. They had no voice, no vote, no say. And so they repeated a powerful phrase again and again: no taxation without representation. This meant, you cannot make us pay taxes if we have no power to agree or disagree. The anger grew slowly, like a fire that builds from a small spark. In 1773, a group of colonists in Boston made a bold and dramatic decision. They went to the harbor at night, climbed onto English ships, and threw hundreds of chests of English tea into the cold, dark water. This moment became known as the Boston Tea Party. It was not just about tea. It was a message, a loud, clear, and dangerous message. The colonists were ready to fight for their rights. England heard the message, and instead of listening, they tightened their control. That decision would cost them everything. The year 1775 was a turning point. Fighting began between English soldiers, called British Redcoats because of their bright red uniforms, and American colonists. The first shots were fired in small towns called Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. Nobody was completely sure in those early days what the fighting would lead to. Some colonists still hoped for peace with England, but one man was thinking much further ahead. His name was Thomas Jefferson. He was a writer, a thinker, and a deeply complex person, full of great ideals, but also, like many of his time, deeply flawed. In 1776, Jefferson sat down and wrote one of the most important documents in human history. He called it the Declaration of Independence. In clear, powerful words, he wrote that all men are created equal, that every person has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These were not just words. They were a promise, a vision for a new kind of country. On July 4th, 1776, the 13 colonies officially declared their independence from England. They were no longer colonies. They were a new nation. They called it the United States of America. But declaring independence was just the beginning. Now they had to fight for it. A small, poorly equipped army of colonists had to face one of the most powerful military forces in the world. The odds were not good. And yet, something kept them going. A belief, a dream, and one quiet, determined leader named George Washington. George Washington was not a perfect man. He made mistakes. He lost battles. There were dark moments when everything seemed hopeless. But he had something that could not be measured. He had the ability to keep people together when everything was falling apart. In the brutal winter of 1777 and 1778, Washington and his soldiers camped at a place called Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. The conditions were terrible. There was very little food. Many soldiers had no shoes, even in the deep snow. Disease spread through the camp. Thousands of men died, not from bullets, but from cold and hunger. It was the lowest point of the Revolution. And yet, Washington stayed. He walked among his men. He shared their suffering. He refused to give up. And slowly, the army began to recover. Help also came from unexpected places. France, which was a rival of England, decided to support the American cause. French soldiers and supplies crossed the ocean to help the colonists. And with that help, the balance began to shift. After years of fighting, after so much pain and sacrifice, the turning point finally came. In 1781, the British Army was surrounded and defeated at a place called Yorktown, Virginia. The war was over. The United States of America had won its independence. It was one of the most unlikely victories in history. A new country, small, uncertain, and still finding its way, had defeated a great empire. And now, the real work began. Winning a war is one thing. Building a country is something else entirely. After the Revolution, the leaders of the new United States faced enormous challenges. They had to create a government, a real system of laws and leadership, from almost nothing. In 1787, some of the greatest minds in America gathered in Philadelphia for what is now called the Constitutional Convention. Men like James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton debated and argued for months. They had many disagreements, but they shared a common goal: to create a government that was fair, that protected freedom, and that could never become a dictatorship. The result was the United States Constitution, a document that described exactly how the government would work. It created 3 branches of government so that no one person could have all the power. It protected the rights of citizens, and it created a system, imperfect,